Hey everyone. Elisa and I had a bit of a recording snafu this week, so we are going to be giving you our response to episode 7 of the Sandman Netflix series, The Doll's House, next week. But we didn't want to leave the feed fallow because we know that y'all love comics and love great stories. So I am giving you the opening episode of In the Gutter, a comic book podcast with me and superhero scholar Joshua Unruh. Joshua is my chosen family little brother, and he has been walking me through a comic book world since we started our MCU podcast, Listen Up A-Holes, many, many moons ago. But now we are walking through actual comic book reading, and I have to tell you, if you have not been reading the Sandman comics, if you have not been reading comic books in general, please use In the Gutter as your invitation to do so. I love sharing amazing stories with people, and I think that if you give this a listen, if you read the comic books that we are reading together, the whole series is all bangers all the time. Joshua is actually curating the best of the best comics. We're talking Ed Brubaker. We're talking Grant Morrison. So many amazing things that are happening in storytelling here with all of the deep literary analysis that you come to love from Chipperish podcasts. So please, if you would like to read along with us, go get the comics, read the first issue of Ed Brubaker's series. There will be a link in the show notes for you, and join along. I cannot tell you how much it would please me to be able to share the joy of reading these comics and discussing them with Joshua with all of you. Thank you so much. We will be back next week with a review of The Doll's House as promised. But for now, I hope that you enjoy In the Gutter.
Welcome to In the Gutter, a podcast that is all comics, all bangers, all the time, with story expert Lani Diane Rich and superhero scholar Joshua Unruh. One of the hosts has read almost no superhero comics, and the other has read almost all of them. We'll let you sort out which is which. And now, In the Gutter.
Okay, it's so weird. It's so weird, Joshua. Okay, so I tried to, first of all, you sent me this and you were like, this is the first issue that we're doing. We decided we're going to do In the Gutter. It's a banger. It's awesome. I'm like, great. Just tell me what it is. So you tell me, and then I go and do a search, and there's like 12 of them on Amazon that are Captain America, Winter Soldier. And so I look Brubaker and there's a whole bunch by Brubaker.
It's true.
And then when we talked about this, we did a little kind of mini announcement on Twitter. And of course, the very first response was like, hey, I've got it. Is this it? You're like, nope. But on the cover of what the Twitter person sent you is a picture of the Winter Soldier, of Brubaker, Captain America, Winter Soldier. I don't even know, I was so worried until we actually, started taking notes and talking about this story. I had a worry in the back of my head that I'd even gotten the wrong one, and you sent me the direct link to get that one. So, what the hell is going on with having there's no, volume number, series number. There's a year, so, if you can find the year, but when you're trying to find this stuff, sometimes you don't see the year. Or sometimes the year, I was looking at this, and it was 2019, because that was when the omnibus volume was published, but not when the original one was published. And I have to say, I'm into it. I'm totally into it. I think this is great. I don't understand how anybody ever finds a comic book that they're looking for specifically. How does that work?
With great difficulty, honestly.
Yeah.
So this series is, so Brubaker's run is over a span of years, right?
Yeah.
And they actually gave him a new #1. So the issue we're going to read today is Captain America #1, but it's volume 5, #1.
Oh, okay.
Now, that's not volume 5 like I have 5 books on a shelf. That's volume 5 like a magazine publishing thing.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Which, with a lot of magazines, they will do it by year or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Comic books
Right.
started to get really excited, especially, I should say, superhero comics got really excited about really big numbers on their covers, like at the point that you're like, this is the 343rd issue of Amazing Spider-Man. That's a big deal, right? Because a lot of times the runs don't go that long, or the character's not successful or whatever. So if you have a character, Spidey is a great example, Batman's a great example, where you have 3+ titles that are all going into the several hundred issues. They don't always like reboot that volume on any kind of regular schedule. And so, for instance, Captain America as a character was in a book called Captain America in the 40s. And then he kind of went away because of World War II ending and the House Un-American Activities Committee making superheroes complicated. And then Marvel happened and they brought him back and he got another book, and that's volume 2, but that's in the 60s. So between the 60s and 2005, they went from volume 2 to volume 5. It's not exactly speedy.
So Captain America, is that because Captain America was just not a big hit? Because when I think of, I mean, of course, you know, understanding that my understanding of Marvel happened, you know, like the big bang for me with Marvel was 2008, was Iron Man, right? So for me, I see Captain America coming out swinging and I'm like, oh, this is a big character. Was it not a big character historically for Marvel?
In the 40s, absolutely. One thing that you and I talked about on our Listen Up A-Holes episode, our MCU podcast, when we were looking at Captain America, I was telling you how popular he was as a character, that his individual issues were outselling Time magazine. And this is in the 40s. When you know, there's not TV, it's radio and it's magazine stands, and he's outselling Time. He was super popular even before we were in the war. And then all superheroes took a big jump in popularity during the war because they got a little, you know, let's charitably call it patriotic. And a lot of comic books were shipped to GIs on the front because they were they were quick and breezy and you could pass them around, you know? So superhero comics intensely popular, including Captain America, through the end of the war. The 50s, and this is a whole history lesson, but the 50s with the House Un-American Activities, the Comics Code Authority, Red Scare, all of that stuff comes together and just makes superheroes deeply unpopular, so that for the most part, they basically go away except for Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. They stay in continuous publication. The 60s come around, DC reboots a bunch of its characters, Marvel shows up and does its thing that's slightly different, and Cap's not part of that original slate. He's actually found in the ice by the Avengers, and then he becomes an Avenger before he gets his own book. And then his popularity sort of waxes and wanes. I think what's gonna shock you is that the reason we got the Avengers and the reason we got the characters that we did is because they were so unpopular in the comics that other movie studios had not purchased them already. Now, I'm not saying nobody was buying Avengers, but I mean, nobody was buying Avengers compared to things like X-Men and Spider-Man sold to Fox and Sony, respectively. So, all
right. So wait, explain to me just a second, though. So there's volume 1, that's the 40s.
Yes.
Then there's volume 2, that's the 60s. What defines, and I know this is probably something you're going to laugh at, what defines a volume? Like, if he was wickedly popular in the 40s, so there were like hundreds of comics, but they were all part of one volume?
Yeah, and so in this case, and I am no expert on magazine publishing, so I'm going to do my best here. But this is the difference between publishing arms, right? Like when you say volume in novel publishing, you know exactly what you get. It's one book, right? It might be a collection of other books, you know, like it might be an anthology, volume 1, 2, 3, or whatever, but that's what you get is a book. In magazine publishing, it's really about the calendar most of the time, but also other vagaries, which like I say, that's why if you have a book that wants to have a magazine, I should say, and comic books, I will say a book because it's just title or book, that kind of thing is interchangeable to me. But in this case, think of them like magazines. If you have a magazine that wants to celebrate, the higher its numbers go, you're going to have fewer volumes because when you get a new volume, it starts the numbering back over. Or it can.
Right.
Yeah. And some of these rules are based on, and I'm not even kidding about this, some of these rules are based on, did you want to maintain your license for second-class mail? Because to just pull a random Marvel example, the reason that Thor was in Journey into Mystery is because Journey into Mystery was the anthology book that they introduced him in, and he became popular enough to become the main story. And so they didn't have to get a new license for second class mail because those cost a lot. Journey into Mystery just becomes Thor. But if I recall, they didn't change the numbering. Like, they just kept the Journey into Mystery numbering. So that kind of thing will confuse this because nobody cared about volumes in a bookstore way until the 1980s. And even then, they didn't care a lot, but they care a lot more now. Like, the bookshelves at your Barnes and Noble are a huge deal for comics in a way that they have never been before. It was all treated like magazine publishing. So a lot of this confusion is that kind of like, we're doing multiple publishing arms at the same time. On top of that, comic book companies are notorious for releasing multiple volumes that cover the same story. Like, here's one that costs about $10 that's on paper you could use as toilet paper. Here's a really nice deluxe edition with hardcover and glossy pages and stuff like that. And then they'll do an omnibus, which is frankly too big, in my opinion. Like, it's like doing homework. If I have an omnibus edition, I got to sit at the table like I'm doing my math homework in 8th grade. I can't hold that thing up. It's terrible. And that's really what happened with this Captain America run. It was so popular that, like, they spit out a real quick edition, and then they do a deluxe edition, and then the movie happens, and they do a whole different version that's, you know, more focused on just the Winter Soldier stuff. I mean, there's just a whole lot of different approaches to make money. And that's before you take into account that names like Captain America and Winter Soldier are also characters in the damn story. So, for instance, our Twitter friend, that story was actually centered on Bucky and Natasha. So it's centered on Winter Soldier and Black Widow. So it was called The Winter Soldier, even though we're also going to have a story called Captain America: The Winter Soldier.
But wasn't there more than one? And this might be just, I got confused and I started running around in circles, but I remember doing a search. And there was more than one, not just Winter Soldier, but Captain America: Winter Soldier. There was more than one, so I was looking for the Brubaker. But my understanding is there was more than one by Brubaker.
Yes.
Is that... Okay, so like when you have the same title and the same author and there are no distinguishing characteristics, like our Twitter friend being a little confused about if that was the one we were reading, like how we distinguish this particular one, aside from saying that it came out in 2004, which again can be confusing if you're looking at perhaps a volume or you know, collection, omnibus, trade paperback, whatever, because those are done years later. How do our listeners find the issues that we're looking for? I mean, aside from there will be links in the show notes, we do have that available, just that you get the right one. But you know, how does anybody know they're reading the same one if they've got the same name? Just a year.
Really difficult. It's really difficult. I'm being honest. This very series was the moment that I realized I was a little out of the loop, because after the movie came out, I sent somebody to the comic book store who wanted to read Captain America stuff. And I said, awesome. Winter Soldier is literally bits of it are based on this long running thing. I recommend starting at the beginning. So just look for Captain America Volume 1 with Ed Brubaker's name on the cover. And they said, okay. And then they got to the comic store and they called me and they were like, there are 3 of those. And they actually had to video call me, and I had to do it from the cover, which I only knew because I had read it already. So I don't have an elegant
There's
solution
no way
this.
to make it make sense. Well,
I
you
have
know what?
one elegant solution. Find a friendly local comic shop that is good and ask for help. That's it.
And
I'm
ask
honest.
for help, because that is the only way to navigate. Yeah. All right. So here we are in the gutter, right? What are we doing today? What are we starting with now? Episode 1 of season 1 of In the Gutter. What are we doing?
However you can get it, we are reading Captain America #1 from its 5th volume in 2004. The first 6 issues are subtitled Out of Time. So we are reading Captain America Out of Time #1. And I'm going to run through the credits right quick. Now, I did as much research as I could. I'm going to give you the, for the whole collection, the credits, because I'm having a hard time parsing out who colored what
who
and
did
lettered
what issue of what. Yes, exactly.
So, and for reference, the one I'm probably going to link is the Winter Soldier Ultimate Collection, which itself is in multiple volumes, but that's the one I'm using. And so our writer is Ed Brubaker. We have two artists. Steve Epting is the main artist, but whenever there's a flashback, that's Michael Lark. Okay. The letterers are VC's Randy Gentile, Chris Eliopoulos, and Joe Caramagna. Assistant editors are Nicole Wiley, Molly Laser, Andy Schmidt, and Aubrey Stitzen. The editor is Tom Brevert. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention, this is mostly for our Listen Up A-Hole fans, that Captain America was originally created by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby.
Yay, Jack Kirby.
I do love Jack Kirby. So that'll cover us through the first 6 issues. We're also going to do the 7th issue, The Lonesome Death of Jack Monroe, whose artists are John Paul Leon and Tom Palmer. So that we will get to that eventually. But today it's issue 1 of Out of Time. Clear as mud,
yes,
right?
Clear as mud. So everyone listening, just follow along and go to your comic book store and support your local comic book store, because the experts there will hopefully be able to help you figure it all out. So let's talk a little bit about what everybody does, right? Because this is something that over on Endless, which is the Sandman podcast that I do with Elisa Whitney, who worked at DC during the 90s. She was an assistant editor for Sandman. We have talked about all of the different roles that people play. And so I'm going to go through them as best I can.
Okay.
But for those of you who want the real expertise, go to Elisa. Is that, of course, written by Ed Brubaker. That is straightforward. He writes the scripts. He's the one who directs the story, is basically, deciding where everything goes. Penciling, Steve Epting, Michael Lark. Penciling is the person who goes and draws like the outline, right? Of like all, like basically draws it, but without the coloring and all of that stuff, like draws the pictures.
Right. If you can find some penciling examples, you can really get an idea of what inkers do. They really add a lot of shading and depth. But yes, pencilers are generally, they lay down the initial page layout, and they do like I say, that you cannot downplay what inkers do, but pencilers really lay all of the foundation that the inkers and the colorists bring out.
And they add like more nuance to what the penciler has put down. They'll bring in those like layers and dimension to it. So they do add a lot to that artwork.
No, absolutely. The right inker and colorer can absolutely make or break otherwise awesome pencils. And they can sometimes salvage really bad ones. There's plenty of anecdotes mixed in here. I will say in this case, from what I can tell, both Epting and Lark are illustrators, is how they're billed, which makes me feel like they're probably penciling and inking their own pencils. And for the record, inking is usually digital now. Like it's not actually done with ink anymore, but that's the job they do, is so we haven't lost, that nomenclature. But a lot of times when you get an illustrator instead of a pencil, it's either they drew it digitally initially, inked, or they inked their own pencils. And it seems like that's what we have here.
And the letterer, let's not forget, is the one that goes in and puts in everything that's inside the speech bubbles, which is also like there's an incredible amount of art and artistry that goes into that when you're talking about how the letterer, I'm sure the emphasized words are probably dictated by the script writer. But still, like there's emphasis on certain words. Sometimes there can be different kinds of font work, especially like Sandman. I've noticed a lot of that going on. When certain characters are speaking, the way that they are lettered is actually different. So it gives you a sense of their voice and intonation and all of that. So there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of creativity going along. And I think the reason why, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why the art needs to be split among all of these people is because we're on a timeline, and that kind of art requires a lot of time. So if somebody comes in and they pencil it, then while somebody else inks inks and colors and does all that kind of stuff, they can then pencil and arrange the next one.
Yeah, that's exactly
so
right.
They can then do that. It's just the timeline on comics is so tight that you have to have a number of people doing all of this artwork. It's just too much work to get done in that time frame.
That is 100% true even now today in serialized superhero comics. A lot of times when you have something that's coming out more episodically, or you have an indie comic that only comes out when they're done, with all of it.
Yeah.
Those duties will still be split up because the skills are just different. Like everybody who can pencil is not necessarily everyone who can ink, and vice versa. So you'll still see that split up even in more episodic or more self-contained stories, but absolutely the splitting up of duties originally started with superhero comics because they've got to put out somewhere between 22 and 30 pages every 30 days. And I'm led to believe the average comic book page takes about a day to draw. So,
oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're sort of always laying track while the train's moving.
Exactly. All right. So now that we have laid our own track so that we understand all of the things, we're not going to have this discussion in every episode. We are going to get into the individual story that we're talking about. The individual story that we are talking about this week, what do we have?
And if nothing else, friends, this is the moment where you can make sure you've got the right volume, because if this makes no sense to you, you read the wrong issue. In Out of Time, we begin with a flashback to 5 years ago, which, to be clear, would have been the year 2000, where we are introduced to Russian General Alexander Lukin, who is surviving the fall of the Soviet Union by getting the heck out of Dodge with all kinds of experimental weaponry and technology. But not before he shoots the then current Red Guardian in the head and tries to sell some of the high-tech gizmos to noted Nazi shithead, the Red Skull. The Red Skull sees a person floating in a vat and he is very interested in purchasing that item, but Lukin isn't having it, unless Skull is willing to trade the reality-altering wish-granting device known as the Cosmic Cube. The Skull doesn't have the cube, but also says it'd be a cold day in hell before he traded it for anything. Flash to the present. That is, 2005, where the Red Skull has pieced together a new cube from shards of previous versions. It's depowered, but the Red Skull has plans to murder a bunch of people in several cities in order to power it up. He's in Manhattan so he can watch Captain America watch his hometown go down in flames before the Skull uses the cube to take over reality. Skull feels that Cap is in a dark place because of everything that's recently happened, including the death of Clint Hawkeye Barton, good riddance, and the disassembling of the Avengers. Cut to Sharon Agent 13 Carter visiting Steve, where we discover she has something in common with Red Skull. She thinks Steve should maybe find some chill before things get worse. We flash back to a week previously where Steve went a little too ham on some AIM-affiliated terrorists. Sharon points out this is exactly the problem, and Steve is a wise-ass and then talks about nightmares because he is extremely mentally healthy. Obviously. Steve sees Sharon off without her benching him for some reason, and we realize the Red Skull is spying on Steve and doing so from literally 1.5 feet away sometimes. We cut to the Skull musing over his impending triumph. He receives a phone call from Lukin, who is offering to purchase the unpowered cube. Skull scoffs, and the two of them swing their respective manhoods around for a minute before someone shoots the Skull dead, takes the cube, and reports to Lukin that the job is done.
Oh my god. There's so much to talk about in this issue. And I have to say, Josh, it's not that I don't trust you. But it's just that, like, here we are, we're going into this comic, and I just wanted to go into it, like, with an open mind, that I wasn't going into it expecting anything from the first issue. That I knew that we were going to read this whole run and that the whole run itself was going to be great. But I was kind of like, well, sometimes things are only awesome when you've turned that last page and everything kind of flits into place and you realize how awesome it is. So my expectations for the first issue were just that it was going to be the first issue of a story that I'm sure was going to be great because I trusted you on that. But holy shit, by the end of this issue, I mean, I was so like, I'm reading it and I'm like, okay, here we are. We're doing this thing. The Red Guardian person, I didn't know who that was. So I was like, it just is a person that he killed, that Lukin killed in the opening. And I'm like, okay, we have Lukin, who's kind of interesting. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But there's so much stuff, like going on here. And I'm like, yeah, this is pretty standard. And then we get to that last bit. and all of my expectations, which, were not that high, are completely blown out of the water. And I'm like, oh, we're doing something completely different here. And I have to say, like, I texted you and I was all caps texting. I was like, oh my God. And Joshua, guys, was loving it. He was texting back and with all these gifts of joy because he knew he'd gotten me.
Oh, yeah.
So this is, of course, my first time reading this. I didn't know what to expect. And I think that the first issue here is incredibly strong. Now, you've read it before. So when we're talking about responding just to this issue, I mean, what are your feelings on that?
Yeah, this is only the third time that I've read this since 2005 or so, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I did know that things were going to pop off hard, and I knew it would mostly be on the last page. So it is weird to talk about my expectations for a single issue. I think that this one does a phenomenal job at hooking you, but it really does it in a very specific genre way, which we will get a little more into as we talk. And just as a look behind the curtain for our listeners, the other series that we're going to cover this season is another big favorite of mine. But as far as first issues go, it could not be more different than this one. Like, it's, you think there's a lot going on in this one, wait until you see the first issue of JLA. It's all just madness and Dayclo, and look, here's the president, and here's the old JLA, and here's the, like, right away, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And so a lot does happen in this issue, but it's also like sort of a lot adjusted for the genre approach, And so I was waiting for you. I was like, it'll be fine. Lani loves a slow burn. This is gonna punch her in the feels in some ways that she loves from the MCU. It's fine. And then so I was not horribly shocked when I got the all caps text message from the last page.
Yeah, it was pretty great. And what's so fun too about this season and doing this new show is that, like, traditionally we've been talking about Marvel stuff, and I've been getting a lot of Marvel background. And here we are opening with Marvel and Captain America. But yeah, for the next thing that we're going to do after this, which is going to be part of our, I don't know what we're planning now, 11 episodes.
Should be about 11,
season 1 of In the Gutter, right? Is we're moving into a DC story, which I think is going to be really fun, because I've always had this sort of idea about what the difference is between DC and Marvel, and it is so unbelievably uninformed, and now the only DC stuff that I've read has been the Vertigo stuff, which, was launched under Karen Berger and is just different, like a different kind of feel from like your classic, DC stuff. I'm very excited to be reading that. And now, but starting with Captain America, a character that I love, in this space, from a writer who seems to me to be very assured in his capabilities here. Like, I'm really looking forward. I've never read anything by Ed Brubaker. I've never engaged with any of this, but I'm really enjoying just being in this comic space. I've learned so much doing the Sandman podcast about how incredibly powerful this medium is and how often it gets just kind of dismissed. So I'm just really excited about it.
I am also excited. I mean, any of our listeners that have followed us from Listen Up A-Holes know that a lot of my frustration with the MCU is not that the MCU is necessarily doing anything badly. It's just that I know their source material. So a lot of times when something comes in kind of at a B- C+ level, I'm like, but you were borrowing from A+ stuff, and you heard that enough from me that I'm excited to bring you into this A+ stuff and be able to kind of ride on your shoulder with it, because all of these stories are going on in the midst of a much larger story. So, you don't know about Avengers Disassembled. You didn't know Hawkeye was kind of dead. I mean, that kind of thing. So I'm glad I'm here to like kind of spackle over that stuff so that we can really focus on how good this story is, because you're absolutely right. Brubaker is a very sure hand as a writer. You won't be surprised to know, largely became known outside of superhero stuff for crime and espionage thrillers. So, yeah, I mean, which you can see the DNA for the espionage thriller is all over his run on Cap.
So one of the things that we like to do over on, I keep talking about the Sandman podcast, but that is where I've been learning all about this stuff, is kind of talk about the cover art. And again, I'm a little confused by all of the cover art and because it's just like an image, that has like the body outline and the number 1 on it. And I'm grateful for that because like I have, the number 1. Oh, no, because that's that's a different thing. Okay, forget it. Sorry. Let me start this over again.
No, keep it in because you're literally going to be the audience viewpoint.
I'm so confused.
Right. Okay.
Yes, I'm the audience viewpoint, but I'm also like much, much more easily confused because there's that one. I was like, there's the one that has like the outline of the body on it, but the cover art itself, is this the last page? Is that supposed to be because that's the one where we have the shot of or we have the image of Red Skull murdered, body splayed, it's got a pool of his own blood, everything is black except for the circle of light on the body. His head is at the bottom of the circle, there's blood pooling around him, it's almost black, it's almost more shadow than blood. It's this very like incredibly like visceral image that feels like a cover image, and it has Out of Time on it, but it's also the last page. So does that count? That's not the cover image. Is it
That's
the cover
the title
image?
Page.
It's the title page, but it's not the last page of the thing. Comics are confusing me, Joshua. I'm so confused.
And usually is doing a lot of heavy lifting when I say this. Yeah. But usually your title page would come at the front of the book. You'd get like the masthead. Right, you might get a little like, bitten by a radioactive spider or frozen in the ice of 19.
Which can sometimes come after like a cold open.
Right. So it can.
Right. So that's a title page. Do we have a cover?
In this case, I feel like Brew wanted us to, we're pals. So I'm just going to say Brew. I feel like Brubaker wanted to start us off running, right? So we are going to just start with a scene and not worry about the title page. And so he does the title page at the end on what is the most shocking image of the book, right? And
what is basically the we're not fucking around image. This is the image where you're like, okay, we did not come here to play. We are really doing something here. And here is that moment where you can pause on the dead body of the person that was set up this whole issue to be the antagonist. Really interesting.
But the actual cover, and I don't want to actually this, because what I'm saying is it's confusing depending on which collection you're reading also, because sometimes
that's true,
they will use the cover to break up the individual issues. Sometimes they will put all the covers at the end so that the story's not broken up, but you still get access to that art because the covers are almost always beautiful, right? And in this case, I'm going to hold it up for you. This is the actual cover, which I will describe to our listeners. So it's an Epting cover, so it's very much of the style of the interior, which not every comic book does that. Sometimes you'll have a very different artist on the cover than on the interiors, but in this case, it's Epting all the way. It's Captain America in the sort of extreme foreground, running directly at your face. In the background, the kind of extreme background, you've got New York City and helicopters and jets and a helicarrier. And in the midground, you have Agent 13. Of course, she's going to be a big deal throughout this whole run. And you also have Nick Fury for some reason. I mean, he is going to be around, but he's not in the first issue. So it's like, all right, I guess it's going to be espionage.
Well, we talked about S.H.I.E.L.D. a little bit. And is Nick Fury the head of S.H.I.E.L.D.? And so there's... Yeah, so there's some of that. Okay, so I had trouble identifying, and this is because I'm reading it digitally in the version, because you sent me a link, and I'm like, okay, I am getting this because I don't trust myself to go and buy something anywhere else if it is not the link that Joshua sent me. So I got that, and I'm reading it online, and that's fine. So we have these like interstitial images because that is the cover for the big book. That's also the cover for the first issue.
Yes.
All right. So we're using the cover for first issue to be the cover for the big book, and then there's these like little interstitials that will have the volume or the issue number on them. That'll be like 1, and so that was just the body outline. There was just a chalk outline of a body, basically the blue and the red and all that kind of stuff. It's not that in depth an image. It feels like an interstitial still image as opposed to something that is really evocative of story and place and all that kind of stuff. So we have some of those throughout. So I guess I'm going to try to find where the cover, but I will say that like the image that spoke to me the most in this read was that final page, that final title page. That feels like a cover image to me, but of course would be full of spoilers were it the actual cover art. So yes, really interesting. Everything is confusing me. Like I was confused when we went into Sandman, and then eventually I got it and it has a system and I understand the system. This is hodgepodge all over the place. I don't understand like what the system is, but the story itself and the art itself, I'm completely totally engaged. I think the artwork here is really interesting. It is very it's very smooth. It feels very polished to me. It feels like exactly what I'd expect from a superhero story, but the colors feel slightly muted. They're a little less bright than I would expect. There's a darkness that is just encroaching on almost all of it. It's not in your face noirish, but it leaves me with the feeling that I am in like a darker world, slightly, it doesn't like dive too deep into like a grunge space because it's still got this very clean, very polished kind of look to it. But I definitely feel from the art that there is a darkness, there is a grown up dark world that we're about to go into. Does that make sense as far as like the art goes? Like what do you pull from this?
The only thing that you said that does not make sense to me is that this is what you expect the average superhero comic to look like, because there's not enough color in here at all.
I think what I expect from a superhero story is that everything is very I don't want to say in your face, but it is right here. It
saturated.
Is doing its thing. It's got the red and like it's less, the colors are more muted, but they are the colors. They're the red, they're the blue, they're kind of like those classic superhero, popping off of the American flag type colors. So we are using those colors. It is very red and very blue, but it is also like less saturated, more muted. There's more darkness, and so I found that like an interesting kind of, but it also has a very polished art look.
I think when you say polished, let me see if I get where you're coming from. So I would describe Epting as a photorealistic artist. It's not. There are certainly artists who are even more, photorealistic. But I would say very realistic. Even Steve is a big guy, but he's not like, cartoonishly large or something like that.
Right.
The Red Skull is, of course, like hideous to look at, but he is not like a bright red. It's more hideous in the cragginess, of it. And from having said that, Brubaker really is most well known outside of superhero stuff for crime thrillers and espionage thrillers. And he wanted to do a Cold War, what felt like a Cold War espionage story with Captain America. This is the perfect art for that. This is great for that. And also coloring, as both at the pencil, ink, and coloring level, because it is dark. It is murky. It is a bright, shining Sentinel of Liberty, ostensibly, who is inhabiting a darker space than he usually does, or where he's entirely comfortable being, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
If I have one sort of complaint about Epting stuff, and this is actually an issue I have with a lot of photorealistic artists who do superhero stuff, is that the action does not have as much life and movement in it as I would prefer. Right. And that's a little bit the realism. And it also just seems like the people who draw more, and listen, I love Epting. Nobody at me over this. I'm just saying in comparison to a Howard Porter, like we're going to see in JLA, or going back further to like, if you can find Kirby Captain America stuff, it's just a much less stiff, the photorealistic people tend to be a little stiff when it comes to the action. But there's going to be a lot of reaction shots in this story and a lot of face acting. And for that, Epting is A++ perfect. So excellent artistic choices all the way down, as far as I'm concerned, for the tone and feel of this story.
Yeah, I think it's really neat. And yeah, when I say polished, I think that is it almost feels glossy to me. You know, like it almost feels like there's, and the thing is that, you know, I'm coming from my first real deep read of comics has come from, of course, Sandman, which, and I know, and as I've talked about in the Sandman podcast, like I know nothing about art. So when I talk, like I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just giving like the impressions of somebody who doesn't know anything about art. That the Sandman art is much more, it feels more impressionistic to me, I want to say, but I know that impressionism is a particular thing. And I don't think that I'm talking about anything that you would actually learn, but it feels to me like it comes from this place of metaphor and myth, and it has sort of these the edges are not as sharply defined in the Sandman art. Beautiful art. Like I'm not saying anything bad about either of the arts, just different art styles. Here, all the edges are very clearly defined. Yes. You know, and I feel like there's a lot of definition to this that I'm not used to because I've been reading Sandman almost exclusively as far as comic books go. So I'm finding that really, really interesting. And I like the way, and that's where like it doesn't feel terribly grungy to me the way that kind of darkness does. It's a really interesting combination of visual flavors here that I haven't seen a lot of. And I'm really enjoying that. I think that it's grabbing me, and I'm definitely into whatever this story is putting down. But let's go ahead and talk about the story now, because here we are. You know, we've gone through the art and all of this kind of stuff. What are you getting from this issue, this story?
Well, I mean, at the highest level, again, listeners who followed us from Listen Up A-Holes know that I am a big fan of spy-fi, which is basically espionage stuff with science fiction elements. And this is a spy-fi story. Like there's a cosmic cube in it. You know, there is a person in a tank with a robot arm. And I mean, you know, it's clearly not a standard mid-70s espionage thriller, no matter how it looks, which is kind of how it looks to me, you know. So it's got all of that spy-fi elements, but they're kind of like, yeah, but be chill about it, right? My general taste run more to something like Man from U.N.C.L.E. or the British Avengers, but this looks like John le Carré wrote a superhero story, and I would be a fool to say that that's a bad idea, you know.
Well, it's funny because like you come from, I haven't read that many of those superhero stories. So for me, like this is my probably, aside from you had me read like the Mighty Thor at one point, all of the comics that you told me to read all throughout Listen Up A-Holes, I never read any of them.
We were busy people.
I will cop to that. So for my first experience, you know, this is my first experience, like really of true superhero comics, of actually getting into it. So like my, you know, expectations are not set. This is setting the expectation for me. So it's going to be really interesting. I don't have anything to compare it to, but as we move into different kinds of stories, like I'm really interested in going to the DC side and the JLA stuff and seeing that crazy.
I can't wait to see. I cannot honestly, this is all going to be great. These stories are great, but also these preliminary conversations, as you see the sort of length and breadth of art style and writing style and story style that you can get in what is honestly, I mean, superheroes just as a concept, pretty narrow until you start adding, well, now it's a superhero spy story. Now it's a superhero fantasy story. Now it's a pure superhero story. What exactly does that mean? I mean, you know, so yeah, I am on some levels setting a baseline so that I can blow it up later.
I'm very excited about that. But I love that this is kind of I love fusion stories where you're taking genres and you're sort of smashing them together and seeing what comes out of that. So I'm very interested in seeing how the fusion of all of these different kinds of stories sort of pulls together in this particular one. But one of the things though that, like, you know, I thought was just amazing is this setup within the story for who our antagonist is going to be.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
We go through this whole thing and it's just, we open up with, you know, Lucan, right? Who is kind of interesting because here they're being invaded, you know, by this Red Guardian character who I didn't know who it was. It was just a guy in a suit. And
the short version is he is Russia's response to Captain America.
Awesome.
There have been several of them over time, but that's the short version is, if you see a Red Guardian, the roots are Russia looked at Captain America and was like, well, we should do
we
that.
Want one of those.
Why don't we do that?
Exactly. All right. So we have this, Russian Captain America comes in. He's going to arrest General Lukin. General Lukin is clearly, he hangs out with bad company. He kills the guy. The guy's like, I'm here for Boris Yeltsin. And the guy has clearly been through some shit, because by the time he gets there, he's already on his last leg. So Lukin kills him without a second thought, but then says, bury him honorably, treat him like he's one of our men. And so instantly within the first few pages, you're getting this sense of this guy as being a complicated bad guy. He's clearly a bad guy, but he's a complicated bad guy. And he has a sense of right and wrong. It may not match everybody else's, but he does have one. There are things that are right. And I'll murder the guy, but I'm going to bury him with honor. That kind of thing is an interesting, really crunchy thing. Then we go into, he's talking to Red Skull, and Red Skull is just evil for evil's sake, just bad, not concerned with anything. He's like, I'm going to enjoy watching you torture this guy. He's like, I am not going to enjoy it. And Lukin is clearly not impressed with that shit, No. And he doesn't torture the guy. He kills him outright, which, in a circumstance like that can be seen, especially as an act of pity, rather than, torturing this guy and putting him through all this stuff. We'll just kill him and end it and all that kind of stuff. So you see this complete contrast. And then it feels like Lukin just hands the baton over to Red Skull, who will be waving it throughout the rest of the story. Just like, this is the antagonist's baton. I have it. And all I'm doing is obsessing over Steve Rogers. And I've got, people who are watching him all the time. I know where he is all the time. And I just want him dead. He is villain monologuing through the whole thing so hard that honestly, I forgot about the interesting layered dimensional character of Lukin, because I thought that was just our opening character and, whatever. So, we go in, we spend some time with Steve. We see that Steve is handling some trauma, which is, I also think, really interesting. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And he's walking through all this stuff, and he's in this, this fake house that has a hologram over it. So it looks dumpy, but inside it's where Steve Rogers lives. And he's just trying to figure out his life. He's lost Bucky. He's lost all these people. He lives in the 40s, which is where the source of his trauma was. And that is a very real experience. When you are experiencing trauma, you live in that space. Time does not go by. You still live there. And when you go back, you revisit it in that moment. So I loved all of that. But then, we're going through all this stuff. We go back to Red Skull. Red Skull is continuing to villain monologue. It's
to no
5
one.
Years after.
To himself.
To no one. He's just obsessed with Steve. And then he's, there's this really interesting part where he's like, well, who are we without each other? And I'm thinking, oh, by the end of it, they're going to lose each other, and we're setting that up. And then boom, done. Red Skull on the ground, bleeding out, dead. And Lukin is the one who's standing there like, yeah, we're going to be doing this my way. And it felt to me like a meta commentary on that kind of villain as well. This evil monologuing, taking up all the space in the room villain. When you make room for a villain or an antagonist, not necessarily the same thing, who will have that crunchy layered dimension while still pushing against our hero, or protagonist, again, also not necessarily the same thing. So, I loved it. I was so in love with it at the end when that happened, because I would have ridden with Red Skull and been like, okay, let's see where this goes. But the fact that he came in and just shot him dead in the middle of villain monologuing, I loved it.
Yeah. So generally speaking, I feel like superhero stories should be pretty broad, right? I do not have a problem with bad for badness' sake or evil for evilness' sake in these types of stories. Mostly because anyone who's heard me talk about this stuff has heard me say, I want superhero stories externalize the hero's internal conflicts,
Yes.
right? Because this is a story that needs to tell its story punching. So I want them to be torn up on the inside, and then that thing that's tearing them up to be embodied in this villain that they can punch, right? But I'm with you. Like, a more nuanced villain is more interesting. And so this whole, like, you start the book and you think that Lucan is going to be like a window into the Red Skull, and then it turns around and Red Skull is actually a window into Lucan. And I am extra good with that in this situation, both because I know Skull is not as far outside of this story as you might think at the last page. I'm going to leave that hanging for the moment. But the other part is that, like, and let me say, this is actually a moment I'll put a small trigger warning, because we are going to have to talk about Nazis. And so if you do not want to hear discussion of Nazis, this may not be the best issue.
This is a moment for you to make a choice.
It's a choice, right? In this case, though, we got to remember, Red Skull is a top to bottom Nazi. And I do not, under any circumstances, want those fucks humanized in a story anymore. Punch them in real life. Punch them whenever you see them, and then punch them because they made your knuckles hurt. I don't want a nuanced Nazi villain. Fuck all that noise.
Exactly.
So we set him up because we can't do a sort of seminal Captain America thing without Red Skull, but then we shuffle him off to the rafters for a bit, and his touch will be felt as we go, but he is clearly not going to be the focus of this nuanced espionage thriller. For that, we need Lucan, a man who considers himself the last good Russian, you know.
Right. Yeah. And that he feels like he has, you know, a mission, like, you know, he believes in something. He believes in what he's doing, and that's why he's doing it. Generally, like, overall, I'm usually going to prefer a more nuanced villain over somebody like Red Skull. That said, I know enough about comic stories to know what to expect there. And having somebody like that, who again is, you know, representative of something, you know, who is, you know, yes, evil for evil's sake, you know, fine. But also, like, there's much more going on in that commentary. And yes, I'm not interested in humanizing any Nazis. So if we have somebody who is a villain, who is a Nazi, then I am going to ride with that person being just all bad. Like, I'm fine with that. And the thing is that narratively, that also works. Narratively, evil for evil's sake is not a problem. You know, as far as like putting together a story and making it work, what you need an antagonist who is blocking a protagonist from getting what they want, and in the end a winner has to be decided. That's, you know, to make it work narratively, that's all you need. But overall, generally, I like an antagonist that makes me love them a little bit, that makes me feel a little internal conflict about how I feel about that antagonist. See Spike from Buffy. So for me to be able to see someone who is so clearly bad, I mean, let's not forget, in the very opening, Lucan has a human person sitting in suspension in a tube.
Right.
Like, this is not a good dude.
Yeah.
In no way is this a good dude, but he is really interesting in that he believes in something, and that he does have a sense of what is right and wrong. He does have a sense of mercy, you know, and that he's not going to make this guy suffer, and he's not going to enjoy torturing anybody. Like, all of that, I think, is really, really interesting. And we have, you know, like Red Skull there practically drooling at the idea of torture as a nice, you know, kind of foil for what we're going to end up with Lucan. So I absolutely love all of it. I was going to ride with Red Skull, but I love it. I think this is really interesting and very unexpected, you know, to me.
I think I can actually bring up a theme that I think we're going to see play out in different ways throughout a lot of this story that will give a little nuance to Red Skull in terms of the story, not as a character, but in terms of what he is to other major players in it. Because if we look at Lucan, we'll start with him. He says himself, I'm all that's left of the true Mother Russia, right? Like, he's convinced that the end of the USSR is a huge sort of moral failing of his nation and his people, right?
Yeah.
Red Skull, not, sadly, the last Nazi fuckhead, but he is the apotheosis of Nazi fuckheads, you know? And we have Captain America, an ostensible sentinel of liberty, right? So these are our three guys: last of Russia, the apotheosis of Nazi jerks, and a Sentinel of Liberty, flag, what is it?
Yeah.
Star-Spangled Man with a Plan, right? But the USSR was not a grand execution of Marx's idea. Hell, it wasn't even really great based on Lenin's. And while the Nazi ethos is sadly still alive and well in the world, I would bet you that Red Skull does not consider toothless crackers as his people, regardless of how many swastikas they have tattooed on them. And let's be honest, if you grant that Cap is part of the greatest generation who fought the last good war, which I think is a bit of a stretch, historically speaking. But even if you grant that, he's still living in modern America, which is fundamentally corrupt and feckless and based in white supremacist ideology more than they would like to admit, considering there's a Nazi standing right over there. And it's colonial, if not fully imperial expansionist. I mean, all three of these men fight for ideals that were tarnished the day they got handed to them and are even worse off today. And that's not accidental. Like that grit is going to be, we're going to be faced with that constantly from these three characters.
Yeah, I mean, I love it because when we talk about Cap, here we have Cap and he is representative of that like deep down home American goodness. And once again, I completely, totally co-sign and rubber stamp, your argument that was fucked when we got it.
It's complicated. It's complicated in a way that not all Americans are comfortable with it being complicated, and pointing to him as, like I say, greatest generation, last good war. Yeah, that's a very uncomplicated look at what ought to be more complicated stuff.
Exactly. But then what we get here in Cap is extremely complicated.
Yes.
We open up with Sharon coming to see him being like, what the fuck, dude? Like he's like, I did my job. But he did it in a way that was was clearly not okay. And especially because we have that contrast, right? Here we have kind of a Cap reflection of Red Skull, not of Lucan, right? Of like, he's kind of enjoying tearing the shit out of these guys and maybe doing his job a little bit too much and getting a little bit too into it. Which of course is clearly like a trauma response for him, because he's very traumatized. And I got to tell you, I love that we're having him process his trauma. But, going back to your point, here we have Cap who is behaving in like, kind of a on the ride to Red Skull. Like we're talking about Cap on the spectrum at one end and Red Skull at the other. Cap's moving a little bit more toward the middle.
It's true. I actually really like that bit, actually, that he is overly brutal, that he treats, I mean, these are terrorists and they're trying to set off a dirty bomb in Coney Island. I'm not saying buy him a cookie, but you have Agent 13 going, yeah, it's a little much, Steve. And while there are some complicated ethical and moral conversations to be had about the superhero concept and how superheroes act in stories. And I feel like a lot of the time, these are friggin' cartoon characters for kids. Like, they're not going to hold it up. They're not going to hold it up. Right. But if we're going to look at it, I really like setting a baseline of Cap is too brutal, and that is a red flag, instead of it being systems normal.
Right.
It's come up. This is a trope that comes up now and then. They used it on Batman after the second Robin died. Like, that's how people knew there was a problem. He was way over the, like, we watch Captain America and Batman beat people up on every page every month.
Yeah.
It's worthwhile, I think, because we want them to still be heroic characters. It's worthwhile that when they do kind of like put a toe over the line, that somebody goes, you're not okay. I love this.
Yes. Well, and we had that complaint often in our MCU podcast.
Yes.
That like people are doing these things and they're saying that because the reason why they're doing them means that they have license to do them in whatever manner they want, and they're still the good guy. And the fact of the matter is that no, that's not true. And that we're willing in here to shine a spotlight on that while we're processing his trauma, which, by the way, hello to that.
I knew you would love it. I knew you would love it.
Love it, because what we do is we put our characters in a lot of these kinds of stories through just unbelievable shit. And then they bounce back and they're just fine and they're ready to fight another day. And you're like, no, you just went through a thing. So we've got Steve. He's suffering. He is living in 1944, where he lost Bucky, where he lost people, where there were people that he couldn't save. And he is really feeling that trauma. And I mean, honestly, to see characters processing their trauma in fiction is more important now than it has ever been, but it's always been important, and we don't do it enough. Because what we do is, like, in stories where people go through all these terrible things and then they're fine, that is reinforcing a message of, if you were tougher, if you were better, if you were Cap, you could handle it. When we think about our own trauma, when we see our heroes processing trauma, that opens up a space for us to be like, okay, I went through a thing, and I know what Steve's talking about when he says he lives in that moment, that he hasn't left it yet, because that's what trauma does. You have a flashback. You are not in the moment now. You are in the moment then. You are reliving that experience. And it takes time, and it takes fucking therapy, and it takes everything to, like, walk through that, understand it, and process that trauma. And when we see these characters, we put our characters through so much because that's what makes good fiction. But we don't often do the cleanup on the back end, which is, I've put this character through this. Like, as writers, I put this character through this. Now I have to work through what I put this character through, because that is also part of what that story is. So as soon as we have Steve there talking to Sharon about his trauma and showing that overreaction, I mean, I had a therapist who told me once that when people overreact to something, that is a trauma flag. That means that there is trauma there. And it's one of those things that, I was saying I had this reaction to something and I don't understand why I reacted this way. It's so over the top. It's more. And I was holding that on me. Like, I can't behave. Like, I don't know how to behave. Like, this is, she's like, no, it's a trauma trigger. And she explained the whole thing to me. And I was like, oh my God, that makes so much sense, And so to have that, like, actually laid out in the fiction, is so incredibly meaningful to me. So, like, that in addition, like, here we've got this, more nuanced villain and Red Skull getting shot in the middle of a villain monologue. And then we've got Cap processing his trauma. It was like this issue was made specifically to delight me. And I absolutely love all of this stuff that we're doing. I have my reservations about Sharon, though.
Oh, tell me. Yeah, let's talk about Sharon.
I think that Sharon as a character in and of herself is fine, but there is something about her being Peggy's niece that feels to me like we are replacing Peggy. Like, Peggy was Peggy. Peggy was back in the 40s. Peggy is in the past. We got to move on from that. Cap's got to move on from that. Totally get it. By making the girlfriend, and they've broken up at this point, so they've kind of gone through that process. But by making the girlfriend her niece, it just feels like she's just as good as Peggy. Shut up. That's what it feels like to me, rather than processing the fact that Peggy cannot be replaced. Cap is allowed to move on, but Peggy cannot be replaced. And there's something about her being her niece that just bugs me. Aside from that, Agent 13, Sharon, she's fine. Like, I got no problems with her. It is purely that conceptual space where I'm like, don't tell me that she's just as good as Peggy because her last name is Carter. She is not,
This is interesting because on page, Steve has so much more history with Sharon than he ever had with Peggy. And honestly, some of the stuff that
seen the shows.
You've seen the shows, you've seen the movies, right? And so much of what was done with Sharon is in the comics is fed backwards to Peggy in the movies. Not necessarily like in a 1-to-1, but they just that level of competency and how important Peggy is. Like, she was a love interest in those wartime Cap comics. But I mean, they were wartime Cap comics. Like it was the 40s, and they were being shipped to GIs, and it was written by two guys who had invented romance comics, but nevertheless still two men, right? So Peggy was just like sort of elevated to the point that it made any sense for her to be on the battlefield with Cap, right? Yeah. Like she's great and important, but I mean, as far as the amount of screen time, page time that we get, it's Sharon all day. And let me tell you,
so interesting.
Let me tell you a thing that'll make you even sicker about this niece business. Remember that originally it was the mid 60s when Cap came out of the ice, which means it had been all of 20 years, which means he comes out of the ice still physically, 23, basically. Yeah. And Peggy would only be in her 40s. Originally,
but
Sharon was her actual niece, not her great niece.
Right.
Yeah. And that's worse.
Yeah.
That is rough.
No, it is.
Yeah.
It is. But it's so funny, though, because there are a lot of these presumptions that I'm going to have based on my experience with the MCU that are not relevant to the story. And that's funny because as I'm talking about Peggy, I am talking about our Agent Carter, the series, the one. Yeah. That is super, super interesting. All right. Well, let me stand corrected on that. No. We are in a different story space.
Your reaction, and you bring whatever you already have with you to it. But that's why I just find that absolutely fascinating. That and I think, the comic book sliding time scale makes it complicated to say. But I mean, I think at this point, however the time works in fiction, Cap has way more of a relationship with Sharon than he ever had with Peggy, even in the 616 fiction, just because of the sheer amount of time that he's been an Avenger in the present, as opposed to the fairly limited amount of time that we can only expand that wartime stuff so far, right? Like the war went from here to here. It's not like MASH that was 3 times longer than the actual, Korean War.
Right. Yeah.
So even with the kind of weirdness of comic book time, we try and get your head around the idea that Sharon is way more vital to Cap's mythology than Peggy is by far.
All right. Yes. No, I absolutely will wrap my head around that. And that makes me like it better. But anyway, so I have questions that I come up with at the end because I'm trying to do this transition from everything I know through MCU and all of that stuff. And one of the things that we've referenced here, we've referenced a couple of things. We've got a body floating in a solution in a tube. I'm presuming that is going to be Winter Soldier. I don't want you to spoil that for me, but that is my presumption at this time that is Bucky. But the cosmic cube that we are referring to with Red Skull, we have a reference to it a couple of times. I am seeing that as being the Tesseract from the MCU. Is that analogous, or is that something else entirely? Okay.
The Tesseract is absolutely the poor man's version of the cosmic cube.
Okay.
Now, the main reason I say that is that we come to find out that the Tesseract is the Space Stone, but what did we ever see it used as? A battery? Boring. Not into it. The Cosmic Cube is an eventually sentient, not at first, but eventually sentient, reality-altering wish-granting machine.
Dude!
Think big, guys. Think big. Battery,
I'm looking forward to
wish machine.
Yeah, I've got to get used to the, the always dialed up to 11-ness of comics. So, okay. So the other thing, and I know we talked about AIM. I know we talked about it when we were doing Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. on the Listen Up A-Holes podcast. But I'm going to need a refresher because I'm trying to remember, AIM was S.H.I.E.L.D. They're good guys, right? AIM is us?
Oh, good God, no. No, very
they're
bad.
The bad guys.
Very
okay,
bad.
All right,
very
all right,
bad. Okay,
all right.
This is as close as we'll get to a little 4-color fact kind of feel, right? Real quick.
Yeah, let's do that.
Very short little history lesson. So AIM is Advanced Idea Mechanics. They are a group of science terrorists who believe in a meritocracy based on scientific brilliance. So the better a scientist you are, the more important you are in AIM and in AIM's vision of the future. Their leader, well, they have a leader that you're familiar with. We'll talk about that fella in a minute. But underneath that guy is the scientist supreme. Like, that's what he's called, right? That's AIM. Now, they started out as a subdivision of Hydra back during the war. They were created by Baron Strucker to create super advanced weapons for Hydra. But when Hydra falls, AIM grew beyond that remit, although Strucker and Hydra sometimes show up and start going, no, but we were here first. You have to work for us. Right. There's a contention there, like that they've grown beyond where they started, but they can't deny where they started, right? AIM is actually pretty decent at their job as science terrorists. They have made at least 3 very dangerous things, one of them being the original Earthbound Cosmic Cube. The first cosmic cube made on Earth was created by AIM. They also created an android called the Super Adaptoid that borrows superheroes' powers. So you just get beat up by your own gimmick. And perhaps the pinnacle of their work, they created everyone's favorite mobile organism designed only for killing. MODOK is the leader of AIM.
Oh my God. All right. I think I got AIM confused with maybe, is it SWORD? There's a Proto Shield organization.
So the MCU wise, what is it? The something scientific reserve. The SSR is the Proto Shield, right?
That's the Proto Shield. That's what I got it confused with.
SWORD in the comics is like Shield in space. SWORD in the MCU is something to do with artificial intelligences and robots. That's why they were involved in WandaVision, right? So they have very different remit. I'm trying to figure out who you might have, gotten twisted around by. But yeah, that's the deal. AIM is bad guys all the time. And they're actually, this is a fun one acronyms. For this. It is. Which, so Hydra is not an acronym, but they often treat it like it is, like they put it all in caps and stuff. This is because the roots of that stuff is in like 60s sci-fi, where you had UNCLE, UNCLE, it stands for stuff, right? Mission Impossible Force is, IMF, like that kind of thing. So that's where the roots are. That's why SHIELD, SHIELD is a big, long acronym like UNCLE is 100% what's going on there. So they have some roots in that.
I get confused by all of these organizations and which one is which. So I'm glad that I asked about it. Yeah.
Buckle up a little bit, because one of the things that's going to happen during this story is you're going to see splinter groups of AIM. Because again, this is sort of treading in some realistic espionage area, right? So the idea that a once very powerful, consolidated terrorist organization would have a massive setback and splinter off because they're cells anyway, right? So you're going to see some other splinter organizations connected to AIM that are, you have to ask the question, are they AIM or are they something else entirely? And that's, and I mean, we've done that, with the, in our, never ending war on terror. We've literally seen this happen with actual, terrorist organizations. So it's kind of neat, to see that reflected in a really over the top superhero way. So I want to ask you something. You have a note in here that I wanted to follow up with you on, because I'm curious exactly what you meant. And we've talked a little bit about this because the differences in history, right, between the MCU and the 616. For those playing at home, the 616 is the mainline Marvel universe, whatever the hell that means. We're just doing our best, friends.
Right.
And you're absolutely right that there's a lot of MCU history that kind of gets pulled from or borrowed from or reimagined, but from this story, but also, the 616 as a whole. But I was curious, when you said that, what specific stuff did you have in mind? Like, what resonances are you really seeing, other than some of the obvious, there's a Red Skull, there's a Captain America?
Well, this is Winter Soldier, right? So here we are, we're in this Winter Soldier story. At this point, I don't know what happens, but I know that we all believe that Bucky is dead, and so does Cap. But there is a man in suspension and yada, yada. So I think that, because the note that I have, which is a ridiculous note, is, hey, there's is the MCU. What are the differences? Like, that isn't
That's, yes,
a 14-hour masterclass in and of itself. But I think that what my main question is how, I would say, give me a percentage of how much the MCU Winter Soldier story is pulling from this Vision by Brubaker that we're reading now.
That's tough. I would say that it is more inspired by than based on.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think that's the best way that I can put it from where we're at right now, but I bet that that's a conversation that we revisit as you get deeper into this story.
Oh, we'll be revisiting all of these conversations quite a bit.
Yeah, they come up. Themes are not just for 8th grade book reports. Sometimes they're also for, really complicated superhero espionage stories.
Okay, so I've said a million times, I love at the end of every conversation to talk about our favorite things and to end on what it was that we enjoyed the most. I really love that In the Gutter is all bangers all the time. So this is always going to be like the easiest part of the show to do. But I wanted to, one of the things that Elisa and I have been doing in Endless, which is the Sandman podcast, was we would pick our favorite page or favorite piece of art.
Yes.
And then go into what our favorite part of the story is, because the art itself is definitely it's all part of the story. It's all part of the same thing. But sometimes there will be a panel or a page that just is so beautiful. And so I always like to look at what is my favorite art from it visually. And so we're going to start with that, and then we're going to go into our favorite part of the story. But my favorite page, I love what we've got going on with the reflections. We see at various times that Red Skull be looking, through a window, and we'll see this reflection, and we have Cap looking through windows and we see reflections on there. And I think that given the fact that we have, we open with Red Skull being this cartoonish enjoyer of torture, for other people and watching people be tortured, way over the top for whatever it is that he's trying to, achieve. He's also just really, really enjoying the process. And then we have Steve struggling with maybe, expressing some of his feelings on terrorists that he doesn't need to express with terrorists, that possibly therapy might be a little bit better for. So he is getting to where, maybe a part of him is also sort of enjoying that torture, really, hurting people more than necessarily they need to be hurt in order for you to stop the bad thing from happening. So then there's this one page where we have Red Skull. He's looking out the window and we see the reflection of Cap superimposed over Red Skull's face. And I love what that does thematically. I think it's a really interesting, kind of analog to make visually in that space. And I just thought it was beautifully done. So that's my favorite piece of art in this issue.
I don't mind telling you that reflections are going to continue to be a thing.
Yeah.
In a more robust way, I am not at liberty to discuss right this instant.
Yes.
So, so I love that you took this really deep thematic look. I think my favorite page as far as the art goes is the first full page that we're introduced to Agent 13. This is a place where that face acting that Epting is so good at really comes through, because she is clearly not here for Cap's bullshit. She's just can you stop jumping around, you fucking toddler? I'm trying to have a conversation with you, right? But she can't. That's what she wants to do. This is Peggy's niece, after all. That's what she wants to do, but she knows she can't do that because he's a big stubborn man from the 40s. So she's got to kind of mollycoddle him through it, and she's just annoyed about it the entire time. But she's also like catch it, soften it. Why do you think that is, Steve? Instead of just, fuck's sake, what is wrong? So there's just a lot going on with Sharon on that page. And again, like I say, when the action, there's some good action in this issue, but it's a little stiff to me. But Epting's doing the thing that we really need Epting to do. And that's that page, because I know a little bit more about their history and how she's just oh, fuck, I could just choke you out. Just talk to me like a human, So good. I love that bit.
No, it's, I think that if I had that understanding of Sharon as a character.
Yeah.
You know, I think that would probably stand out to me a little bit more too, but I love that. Okay, so my favorite story moment is, I mean, it's when Lucan's assassin takes out Red Skull. Red Skull, who has been like, you know, sitting there bragging about all of the spies that he has watching. He's just taken off the fake face that he has as he walks by Steve and looks over his shoulder, and he's so proud of himself. And then, and I love too that it's not Lucan, but it's Lucan's assassin. Lucan has been doing the same thing to Red Skull.
Yes.
And has taken him out. So it's another reflection, right? Where Red Skull's own tactics are then used against him. And he thinks he's so smart, you know, but then he ends up getting taken out. So I loved it. I loved it. And that moment, of course, of, oh my God, like I wasn't expecting, you know, I was expecting this to not like follow through with that nuance that they set up, even though they set it up. And that's one of the things I love too, when you look back at what you did not expect and see that all of the clues were right there for you, that you should have expected exactly this. And yet they still get one past me. I love when that happens.
I mean, God bless them for doing a game changer on the end of the page of the first issue. I mean, it's first issue and it's like, haha, it's completely not what you thought.
Exactly.
So we have the same favorite part, but you love it for story reasons and I love it for character reasons. It's just fascinating to me. So, like I said earlier, I have zero problems with a villain that's evil for evil's sake. I believe those people exist in real life, so please put them in my adventure fiction, especially when I want to focus on my protagonist, my hero. But at the same time, as mentioned, Red Skull's a Nazi fuckhead with delusions of grandeur. But the thing is, in order for us to maintain stakes, the delusions of grandeur can't be as delusionary as we would like them to be. Like he has to win some, you know, in order to over the course of, you know, issues and decades and things. I mean, but here we have him monologuing for an entire issue about how truly evil he is. And if I had a mustache, I would twirl it. Behold my destiny. And this was a line that stood out to me. I could put a bullet. He's thinking to Cap. I could put a bullet between your eyes at any time I want, and you'd never see it coming. But that would be too easy. And then that's what happens to him. So I say, welcome to your ignominious death, you Nazi fuck. May the tribe of dead, boring Nazis increase.
Well, I think on that note, we can probably talk about, okay, so now that we have anchored ourselves in the first issue and I don't have to wander through endless fields of Captain's America Winter Soldier, and I know what we're doing. What are we doing next week? And what is, like, do we have a little bit of a hint of what's to come?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to spend next time looking at Captain America Volume 5, Number 2, Out of Time, Part 2, which I will sum up as Steve gets the news about the Red Skull and takes it poorly.
Ooh, interesting. Well, I can't wait to read that. Okay, I'm just, whatever. It's the end. It's been an hour and a half. It's all fine.
You did great. It's fantastic.
I did.
You
what?
could go into the music with ooh and be in great shape, I think.
No, I'm going to leave all this stuff in. Are you kidding me? This is what it's like to hang out with me and Joshua, where I just ramble on.
The bloopers. Behold the bloopers.
There you go.
Thanks for listening to In the Gutter with Joshua Unruh and Lani Diane Rich. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider talking about it with your friends, leaving a review somewhere, or supporting Chipperish Media, patreon.com/Chipperish.